Okay, well, I think it kind of maybe it makes sense for me to start with just the introduction of DVSAC, and then that'll take a couple minutes and people will flood in. I see we're at 56 and people will continue to trickle in as they come in. So first of all, great morning, happy Friday, and thanks for coming to today's event. My name is Frank Stern. To everyone here, I'm from Penn State Abington, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the 47th Annual Delaware Valley Student Affairs Conference. On behalf of myself, the other conference co-chair, Allison Gleason, and the entire planning committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third event of our virtual slate of programs. We talked a little bit about this, but the pandemic has thrown a little bit of a wrench in our normal day-long in-person programs, but we're excited to provide you with the same quality of experience that you generally get from us. So we've been hard at work as a conference or as a committee planning since June of this year to make these sessions a success. Many brainstorming sessions and what ifs, and as you'd expect, but much like any well-planned student affairs program, the success is the combined result of a dedicated team. Our planning committee is a dedicated group of student professionals from around the region, from various different universities, who do this out of just their own time, in their spare time. So at this time, I want to, conference chairs want to just recognize them, everyone on our team that made this session a success. They are a group of hardworking, creative, and dedicated professionals, and they deserve that, virtual round of applause. It's kind of weird with, but we'll give them that virtual round of applause here. So with that being said, we are always interested in new members. If you're in the audience and haven't been on DVSAC, consider joining us. We have a lot of fun. We enjoy putting these conferences together, and it's really great to see all the people that attend our sessions when we have the in-person events, just to see that all come to fruition. It's a really great experience. So after the session, there's an interest form in the reception area. You can fill it out. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. Feel free to scroll to the bottom of this page. All of our great panelists and their bios are down below if you want to learn a little bit more about them. As a reminder, only presenters will be given access to share audio and video, but please use the session chat or comment to ask questions. We also have questions Q&A at the end, so if you want to hold your questions to the time, we will save time at the end for that, and we'll monitor the chat throughout the event for questions. After today's session, the last thing is, or second to last thing, you'll be given a feedback form, which we would really appreciate you filling out. You'll see it via email. You'll also see it in the session as well. So please fill that out. And finally, I'm done, almost, I promise. I'd like to just thank our panelists for their availability and their insight and their expertise today on this really important topic. I'm really looking forward to listening and learning. So thank you all for spending your time and your morning with us this Friday. So without further ado, let me introduce DVSAC committee member Diane Cardenas-Elliott from Kutztown University, who worked very hard in making today's session happen. And she will introduce the program and the panelists, and take it away, and I will magically disappear through the magic of hop in. I will hop out, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks, Frank. I'm delighted to be here today to introduce our panelists. They have each been specifically selected because of their expertise and the unique perspectives that they bring to the issue of institutional racism. So without further ado, let me start with Dr. Janae Akbar, who is an associate professor and serves as the program director and department chair of the Graduate Social Work Department at Westchester University. There, she teaches classes specialized social work, practical methods, mental health, mental illness, as well as electives she recently developed on the intersection of social work, social movements, and social media, and one on radical social justice. Samuel Myers is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Delaware Valley Community College. Prior to her current role, she led diversity and inclusion efforts at the Center for the Advancement of Teaching at Temple University and has taught as an adjunct instructor for both undergraduate and graduate students. She has a master's degree in applied sociology from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her research interests examine how effective and inclusive teaching strategies create equity for students. Don Ray Bennett is a graduate student. He's a seasoned educator that began his career in education as a high school math and science teacher in Honduras, Central America. He also spent several years as an elementary school principal. The majority of his 14-year professional career has been spent in college prep programming with at-risk students. Currently, he is the founder of Diversity Relations Alliance, a group of consultants in diversity-related areas, and he wears multiple hats. He is also the Assistant Director of Admissions at Kutztown University. He is an alum of Kutztown University and has successfully completed the Executive Principal Leadership Academy at The Ohio State University. I know the is very important when you're talking about Ohio State. And last but certainly not least is Scott Blair, Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Desales in Central Valley, PA. Scott Blair has a Master's of Education degree from Kutztown University, and he has spent the last 15 years in higher education in a number of capacities, including diversity and inclusion, academic support services, Title IX compliance, and athletics. Most recently, Scott is focused on engaging educational institutions in supporting students, faculty, and staff to navigate the world of inclusion in the college setting. Scott currently serves on the United Way of Greater Lehigh Valley's Diversity Committee as co-chair on the board of Lehigh Valley Interregional Networking Consortium. Blair is also the co-chair of LINC's Diversity Council and also serves as a member of the Community Action Committee of the Lehigh Valley Color Outside Initiative. Since moving to the Lehigh Valley in 2018, Scott has partnered with a number of businesses and educational institutions in the Valley to assist them in building in their DEI strategy to meet the needs of their employees, customers, and students. So without further ado, I will let Dr. Akbar take over from here, and we, I think, are all very excited to hear this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is staying warm and safe. I guess the best place to start this morning is to sort of have a discussion about what exactly is institutional racism. And so when we're thinking about when we think about regular, right, racism, we think about maybe an individual or even sometimes an organization that has, discriminatory or negative sort of views about a certain group or towards a certain group. But institutional racism is that next level. It's that larger level when you're looking at how the institutions or policies that we're involved in impact different racial groups or racial demographics. So for example, institutional racism sort of is infused within our social services, our legal policies, our employment policies, government agencies, and of course, what we're here today to discuss, our educational institutions. So rather than an individual person doing something negative against another individual person, it's really the experience of how the institution, the larger institution, negatively impacts different racial demographic groups, groups that are often marginalized or vulnerable groups, right? And so one example of how and I'm going to ask the other panelists to sort of give us some examples of how this shows up in education. One example that I can think of in my experience, I went to University of Penn for my doctorate. And so in my doctoral cohort, there were about, maybe 18 or 20 individuals in my cohort. About half were white and about half were people of color, all different types of people of color. So the joke was that, oh, the people of color never graduate or never graduate on time, right? The Black students don't graduate or graduate on time. So in a program that was supposed to be a 3 or 4 year program, ended up being a 4 or 5 or 6 or never graduating program for the people of color. And why was that? I don't think it was because any of our professors or individuals were particularly racist towards any of us, right? They weren't negative to us. They didn't treat us badly, but sort of built into University of Penn and built into the program, there were experiences that preferenced white students, right? So white students, students that had more social capital were the ones that had connections with professors, were the ones that already had connections with University of Penn, were the ones that were able to use these connections to get people to be on their dissertation committees versus the Black and brown students who may not have had that experience or may not have had that social capital to make those connections. And so it took us a little bit longer to finish our degree if we ever did at all. So that's one of my most sort of like, relevant examples of how it's impacted my life. So I just want to open it up to some of our panelists. Maybe they can throw in some examples of, institutional racism, either that they've experienced personally or at their universities.
So I know we're talking about higher ed today, right? But I wanted to also maybe first think about how students experience institutional racism before they even come to college, and then how it's been perpetuated. So one, I think, really important thing that we can focus on, especially when we're looking at K through 12, is a process called tracking, which essentially puts students into different educational tracks depending on say their ability level or test scores they've received. And what we often see this as, especially in high school, is AP classes versus non-AP classes, or sometimes more remedial classes. And so what happens is, even from a really young age, part of how students are chosen to be put in higher level classes or lower level classes is subject to racial bias. So sometimes teachers will be more likely to put students of color in lower track programs, more likely to put male students, students from low income backgrounds in lower track programs. And what happens is, as students go through the system, they're less likely to succeed. They're less likely to have teachers who actually think they can perform, because they've been kind of tracked into this lower identity, and that follows them throughout their education. And so then when they come to college, they may be more likely to take remedial classes. They may need more support. And sometimes what we see is this manifest as instructors thinking that these students are less serious, don't have what it takes to succeed. And we kind of see this perpetuated over and over again. And of course, disproportionately impacting students of color and low income students. And so I think that's just one way we see the kind of continuum, not only in higher education, but coming from K through 12, that we're kind of perpetuating these systems together.
Absolutely. Then those are some great points, because obviously that impacts how students show up in higher ed. Absolutely. Scott or Donray, you want to jump in?
I'll pop in really quickly to further articulate that point of not only the system, but let's talk also about the experience that our students have while they're in our educational settings. And, as we are here, of course, it's February 19th. So we're honoring Black History Month. And I think this is an important item for us to articulate, that when you're a student of color, whether it's in the K-12 setting, and I'll step aside on the K-12 narrative for Mr. Bennett to speak more on that. But when we talk about diversity and inclusion in our academic experiences, we have to really lean in and ask ourselves a question of, why are we teaching particular narratives the way that we are and excluding others? So for us, as students of color, for example, in the academy and in K-12, when we start talking about self-worth and identity development, and of course we're at a student affairs conference, so we need to mention theory, right? That's an important aspect to start asking ourselves at the development of a student. If you're sitting in a classroom and you never see an example of Black and brown excellence when you're in a classroom, what sort of messages does that send to you about your self-worth and your ability, right? We understand the power of representation, and the examples are out there, but unfortunately we have we have not included those examples in our educational experiences. That's what it means to be diverse, right? What are we teaching in our curriculums? That's a very important question for us to ask. And when we start talking about institutional racism, that's one of the first places where I think it's kind of a low-hanging fruit. Let's get those things out, and let's be intentional in what we're providing to our students in the classroom so they can see that they matter, right? That they can see that the representation matters. And then the ability, that's all going to take care of itself. We just have to be able to reinforce that we belong, we are important, we have value. And when we start there, the foundation's strong.
Absolutely.
And outside of the academic forum, or at least the classroom, a campus is designed, or we talk about growing holistically and getting involved, and important that is to find other measurements of other measures of engagement. So I'll speak specifically to an experience I had when I was an undergrad and joining the student government board, because each of the what was considered multicultural organizations that I belonged to seemed to be underfunded. Every entertainment individual that came on campus, every speaker or whatnot, was not very representative, as Mr. Blair, to students of color, and so we wanted to see that representation. And as a leader, I found that the main determinant of how much each organization was getting was at the student government board level. And so I joined. I was lucky enough to get elected, and the conversation that was taking place there was mind-blowing, at least for me at that time. And the thought was, there weren't 3 or 4 individual or 5 or 6 individual clubs or organizations that were representing different multicultural groups, Black and brown students. They saw it as one large thing, and got $10,000 to Black and brown students. No, you allot $500 to the Black Student Union. You allow $500 to the brothers and sisters seeking excellence. And so it was almost grouped as if one. And so at that moment is when the wheel started to turn. I started to realize that the issues are much deeper, and in how we're seen. Of course, how we see ourselves, but then how we're seen by even our peers, who seem to carry more power and influence than we did, at least back when I was there. Now, I'm proud to say that the institution has moved towards having an additional governing body that is composed exclusively of diverse students. But it goes down to that level. It's not just the administrators and the teachers, it's the actual peers that sometimes wield more influence. And that's not perception, that can be fact when you look at some of the governing bodies and influence that some of these student organizations can have as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Don Ray. I wanted to sort of just link back to something Scott mentioned a little while ago, just talking about this idea of representation. And I remember I have 2 daughters. One is 8 and 9, and the other is 13. And when my 9-year-old was in 1st grade, her teacher said to me, we went for a school conference, and her teacher said to me, she's showing me around the room. She said, I make a real effort to make sure that all the books in our classroom are focused either around Black or brown writers or Black or brown experiences. She said, these kids will be reading about white experiences and white authors for the rest of their academic career. So I really try to make sure that I don't do that in 1st grade. And I thought, I was so grateful for that. And I just thought, what a difference that could make if, K through 12 or even through, higher ed, we made an effort to make sure that our learning resources and learning materials were inclusive and diverse from all different writers and all different theorists and all different. And so, even as a program director of a social work program, I'm having to look at my curriculum and make sure that are the materials that we're using diverse. If I'm saying that we have our department and our program has a commitment to anti-racism, it doesn't jive that I'll have, all authors or all learning materials from all white writers. And so I thought that was so great that she had that insight as a 1st grade teacher, and how wonderful it would be if we all could do that, throughout a child's educational, career. Scott, I also wanted to ask you, there's a lot of ways that these institutional isms can show up, and a lot of different isms that can show up. There's institutional sexism. There's all different kinds of ways that marginalized or vulnerable groups can be discriminated against. Why do you think it's important to start with race or racial identity as opposed to some of these other marginalized identities?
That's a really good question. And I'll start by responding to that of our attendees. And as I see, we have roughly 85 folks here. So it's a fantastic turnout this morning. That there's a difference between DEI work and institutional racism, anti-racism work. And I think it's important for us to kind of set that context. That when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, in a lot of ways, that's kind of the umbrella, right? That's building the foundation of understanding. What is diversity? It's a descriptor of who we are. What is inclusion? It's ensuring that we are intentional about our access, right? Representation. Really leaning in to ensure that everyone, regardless of your background, you can be who you are and be that well on our college campuses. Anti-racism, and then is a deep dive to address the inequities that we've started to explore this morning. Now, why do we start with race, to answer your question? Unfortunately, as we've navigated in remedying some of the isms in the academy, race has been the start, and then it gets pushed aside. Mm-hmm. And there has been more than enough research, I don't need to quote it here for folks who are attending, who talk about, for example, when we advance gender equity work, that intersection of gender identity and race, how that has come into conflict. And unfortunately, our women of color, for example, their experiences have been pushed aside. Same thing for our men of color, right? And then we start getting into this work, and unfortunately, we have a deficit response and a transactional response to how do we lift up our under-resourced communities. So it's a long answer to a simple response to your question of why do we start with race? We need to start with race, and we need to see it through. We need to see it through. And when we focus on race and ethnicity, that work and that understanding, it's transferable. When we focus there, we're able to lift up other identities, LGBTQ+, go down the list, supporting our veterans on our campuses. But we need to be intentional on focusing on race and seeing it through. Because if we don't, we're going to still live in the cycle in which, unfortunately, we have been living in for too long. And we have seen front and center since this past summer, most notably after the loss of George Floyd and countless others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Scott. Absolutely. So I remember when I was in graduate school, I read an article about, I think it was Smith College School of Social Work, and how they made a commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization. The article was from maybe around like 1997 or 98, something like that. And they talked about how they had to address every aspect of their program, from hiring to admissions to curriculum to, where their building was, everything. And I thought, in my sort of like early understanding of racial issues and diversity inclusion, I thought, wow, it's not as simple as just you run a couple of workshops on how to be inclusive, right? This work is really difficult. And so I want to put it out there to the panel, why is this work so hard? Why is this work so hard?
Well, I think firstly, especially when thinking about kind of the question too of why start with race, I think we all kind of as a nation do have a deficit in being able to talk about race. For many years, it is kind of perpetuated that you shouldn't talk about race, that it's not something that you should focus on. There's kind of a moment in history where we were focused more on being colorblind than really thinking about what our differences mean and how we experience them. And so I think right now, and I think kind of the focus of 2020 and beyond has helped that in some ways. But it was a moment where people were saying, oh, what we've been doing thus far is still not working. Our systems are still broken. They still have flaws. And what we're finding out is that we haven't done a lot of that core work, right? We haven't gone back to those foundations and re-examined them. Like you said, the school that's saying, hey, we really have to look at everything. We can't just do one thing and assume that everything is then going to magically, fall into place. But I think the big issue is it's important to talk about race because we haven't really been trained to do so. And so being able to give people the tools to actually start thinking about race and what it means, I think is part of why the job is so hard, because we're kind of working against almost a taboo topic and making it something that people feel safe to talk about, and people feel like there's actually a way to communicate with each other about this subject.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I agree. And also, I think over the past few years, definitely over the past year, we've had sort of a reckoning, right? Where it's like, it's kind of funny because it's something that Black people and Black and brown people have known for a very long time, that institutions are racist, that people are racist, that this issue of race sort of permeates lots of parts of American society. But it's like lots of other folks are finally catching up with that over the past year. But what it has done is allowed for us to be able to start having more of these difficult conversations in lots of different areas. So I think I'm grateful for that, even though it's difficult to sort of watch the rest of the world catch up with something that we've known for a very long time. Yeah. Don Ray, do you want to jump in on that? Do you have anything to add?
I do. I think from those who are delivering the work, delivering the trainings, the workshops, the experts in the field, I think from my perspective and the countless workshops and presentations I've been a part of, I fail to see the leadership in those. It's always in the folks on the ground, the employees here and there, but I don't see the presidents and the vice presidents and associate vice presidents. And I feel as though perhaps inside there's a level of humility that's missing, because they would have to reckon with the fact, or somehow reconcile with the fact, that they are a part of and a major cog in the system that has been oppressive to a demographic per se. And so what I often see or hear or have experienced is, I'm sure a lot of you can probably relate to this, the training will start out with, today we're going to have a real difficult conversation. And then the only people who talk are those who have been on the receiving end of it. And then what ends up happening is an individual may get so personal with it, they may go to an extreme that that includes some qualities of the oppressor that another individual in the audience doesn't identify with. And now everything else that person has said is disqualified because, oh, they're not talking about me. I don't fall into that little cog. And the right individuals there to take that message and then make it permeate through the planning for reconciling the institution, they're not even present or not engaged. And so oftentimes I feel like a lot of shops that are there to really progress this narrative, this conversation, fall on deaf ears, or there's no real follow through because of the lack of intentionality by administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've definitely had that experience where it's like you want Black and brown people to sort of relive that racial trauma that they have for the good of the audience, but it's like, we've heard enough of that. Let's get to the solutions part where we're starting to, build it so that we don't have to have those experiences anymore. I also was thinking about our program and some discussions that we've had in our department about ways that our department, that we're, like you said, we're all part of the issue, sort of working in higher education, whether we want to admit that or not, but looking at ways that this shows up in our department. So we've had conversations about, for example, writing, right? So like we have students that come in who maybe aren't the strongest writers in terms of what a traditional college writer should be, right? But how do we broaden that understanding of what good writing is and allow for students who may have great critical thinking skills, have great social work skills in other areas, but, and sort of like, how do we assess that, right? Because our traditional grading and assessment goes by how well you can write an APA style paper, right? But we know that that might not be the best way to assess how, for example, in my program, how good a social worker that person is going to be, right? And so how do we adjust for that, and how we are assessing students in our program who may have other strengths that don't fall into the traditional good grading structures of what academia is like. So I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to or think about other ways that these sort of institutional racist experiences show up in different programs or different places in higher ed.
If I could jump in, and my response even piggybacks on the last question too, of why it's so hard, is we're unwilling to change. It's hard to change. And if we're really critical about our academies, right, we're talking about structures that are more than 400 years old, right? The first college in America in the United States is Harvard, right? And it's founded almost 400 years ago. And the basis of the institution's creation is even older than that, right? We're going to Cambridge, and we're going to Oxford, and folks might respond and say, well, Scott, what do you mean? It's 400 years ago, we've come a long way. Well, have we? Walk into some classrooms. Some of the history still lives there, right? If you have a classroom that has tiered steps, that's kind of a tip of the cap to even Greek amphitheaters, right? So some of those historical structures are still there to this day. So that's a long way to come back to the question of, again, why is this so hard, and what does it look like in the academy? It looks at everything from our hiring practices. How many times have we been in a search committee, for example, and the word fit is dropped? Well, they're not a good fit. Those of us who are in the positions of DEI practitioners, right, we understand what fit means. That's cover for bias, right? That's cover for, is this person of color going to fit in here, right? Are they going to cause too much noise? Are they going to make this too difficult for us? And that list kind of goes on and on. But that's one place and where it lives. And sometimes the subjectivity, again, enough research and scholarship speaking to the bias that's introduced when we look at resumes, what name shows up, and what sort of unconscious bias steps in to determine how we evaluate that resume, how we support our students. This was mentioned earlier as well, that when we are, for example, working with students of color and we see some maybe they're not persisting or retaining at the rates in which other students are, unfortunately, we pop in and we say, we have these deficit approaches to fixing those deficits, right? As opposed to asking the questions that the Sean Harpers and others state, which is, instead of putting it on the students, how about we flip it and ask ourselves, what are we not doing to allow our students to excel in our classrooms? So those are some examples. I'll stop there for the rest of my colleagues here to pop in that exist. We know they exist. So again, going back to that question of what are we going to do about it? What sort of intentional efforts are we going to make to dismantle some of those archaic structures?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Scott. Samuel or Don Ray?
Yeah, I think that if we're specifically to maybe focusing on faculty and maybe different faculty approaches, is that we have to remember that all faculty come into the classroom as experts in their field, right? But it's not required necessarily to have any training on pedagogy, on how students learn best, and even less likely for it to be diversity training, anti-racism training, inclusive teaching training. This is something that right now a lot of different schools are kind of trying to make up for and trying to bring in more resources. But what often happens is that there are big initiatives and then faculty kind of have to implement it. But the question is kind of a how. Do we have the resources to do it? How do I incorporate this into my math class, right? How do I incorporate this into my physics class? And I think we have to also consider how we're bringing in resources, right, to better support faculty, to better create channels where people can actually consider how to then make their courses more inclusive or make their courses not representative of models we've seen for years. So I think kind of building on what Scott said, often the way people design courses is based on how they learned best, right? And as students become more and more diverse, we're more likely to see students who maybe learn differently from their instructor or have different motivations for learning. And so I think it's important to give that support to our faculty so that they have the tools then to make more inclusive courses and also to make kind of curriculum design decisions that support all student learning.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that she hit the nail on the head. I think we've got to be extremely intentional about it. If you're going to if you're studying in higher education to and develop, why are we hiding behind strategies and trying to implement things? Have a course, a course as part of your first year, experience or whatever, the first year freshman seminar. Have a course where students must sit in there and be taught this type of information, and are forced to have these types of conversations that start with the students, and that's not limited to them. As Scott stated, let's have faculty attend these courses as well until they're at a level that we deem, by whatever measures are in place, at a level of a mindset where they can implement these practices in their classroom throughout their coursework.
Absolutely. Westchester has a very robust new faculty orientation, a week long, the week before semester starts. That's a great place, I would think, to start to introduce some of these topics and how they can sort of manifest in the classroom. So Samuel, this next question is for you. And also, I just want to say, I noticed in your bio that you went to UMBC, and that's where I went to for undergrad.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So, we're starting to see more attention, I guess, because I think these positions have always been around, these diversity officer, director of diversity inclusion positions. They've always sort of been around, but I definitely think there's more attention to them now as we're sort of trying to navigate this new racial landscape of how to talk about these issues in universities and in higher ed. Can you talk a little bit about, I think Scott talked a little bit earlier about the definition of diversity and inclusion, but maybe talk a little bit about what your role is or what the role of these positions are and how and why they're important in higher ed.
Yeah, so I think that as we've seen the expansion of roles like diversity officers, of course, there's been a lot of questions for, what are they here for? Why are they here? And so I think first, when thinking about the definitions of diversity and inclusion, when we're thinking about diversity, and I know Scott said a bit about this earlier, but we're really looking more at the numbers, kind of who's there, kind of what percentage do they make up. And a lot of times this is based on looking at the larger population, right? And so the US is roughly 13% African American. So we would expect for our higher education institutions to have at least 13% African-American students, right? And if you're in a place like Philadelphia, maybe you'd expect to have more. If you're in a place that is more in a rural area, maybe you'd expect to have less. But we're really looking at kind of the balance in the population, right? And who is at the table, so to speak. And then when we're talking about inclusion, we're thinking more about, do our policies actually give value to this diversity? Do people actually have a voice at the table, so to speak? And are we doing things that are keeping our students invested, that are helping our students graduate? So the way I think about it is that diversity is, for students at least, more of a focus on, say, enrollment, while inclusion is more looking at retention, graduation, persistence. Are we doing things to keep our students there and to help them succeed? And I think for these DEI roles, what people often assume is that it focuses more on just the diversity piece, that we're there to maybe reach quotas, that we're kind of just trying to bring in as many people of color or diverse others as possible. And that is kind of the job. And I think in some cases, when diversity officers are placed just in HR, that can be a big focus of their role. But I think for many, it's that inclusion piece that we spend a lot of our time on. It's thinking about policies, it's thinking about the culture of an institution, it's thinking about big changes. Sometimes it is doing those trainings where we're about to have a difficult conversation, but kind of really moving through it in a way that's strategic and that is helpful to people at the college. And I think ultimately, because we are saying diversity and inclusion, but the E, of course, the equity piece is what then we're aiming for. And so that we're looking at both elements of diversity and inclusion and thinking about, okay, how are we making it so that for any student who comes in, no matter their race, sexuality, their gender, that they all have an opportunity to succeed, that we don't have structural barriers in place that we can assume are going to trip students up because we know they exist. And I think that is really the big focus of the role for those who are a little less unfamiliar of the inner workings. But I do know that they tend to vary from place to place depending on how they're implemented and the charge. But one myth I always like to debunk is that it's often that, something bad happens, so we have to swoop in and solve the problem, right? I think most people don't like coming into a job knowing that there's a problem they have to solve, a critical problem, and that the focus is really the long-term success of students in that equity piece.
Great, thank you. Scott, did you want to jump in on that? And I also wanted to just add a little follow-up piece to that, like how do you think the colleges and universities in Pennsylvania are doing in this area? Like, are we doing a good job? Do we have, DEI positions at many of the colleges? Are they working? Like, what's your take on sort of the bird's eye view landscape of what's happening at our universities?
I appreciate that question, and my response to that comes from my time in the State University of New York system, where I spent 10 years from 2008 to 2018. And I was at the right place at the right time when the SUNY system rolled out a very comprehensive system-wide DEI effort in roughly 2015. So 6 years ago, right? Just about 6 years ago, requiring things such as every institution within the SUNY system was required to have a chief diversity officer. Also the development of a diversity strategic plan, and kind of going down the list. That was 6 years ago. Where is Pennsylvania? That's the question. Where is Pennsylvania? Where in the opportunity, right? So to those who are here from Apache institution, y'all did the UMBC thing. So Donna and I will do the Kutztown thing, right? But asking that question, and SUNY was the first system in the country to mobilize, and since then, we've seen the Cal system pop in and do some things soon after. Pennsylvania's not all that far away from New York to be able to lean in on some of that scholarship and best practice. And it's not a political statement when we say that we want to be intentional about our efforts about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important for us to state that because of the current climate we're also in as well. And as was mentioned earlier, diversity inclusion efforts is simply ensuring that our students and faculty and staff, oftentimes the DEI work is perceived as a student-only initiative. It's also for our faculty and staff. It's to ensure that everyone can be themselves when they're on campus. And when you're yourself, right, you're able to engage at a different level. And then the products you can produce, whether it's as a student, faculty, or staff, intensify. That's what the work's about. This is love work. This is work of just making sure that our fellow students, faculty, and staff can be successful on our college campuses. And so when you ask the question of where Pennsylvania is not much different than the rest of the country, quite frankly, but we need to get going. The American Association of Colleges and Universities just last year released a scholarly article speaking to the fact that, yes, we all know that the current enrollment trends overall for high school seniors, that there's a cliff in the next couple of years, right? The numbers are dropping. However, within that decline, there's also an upward trajectory. And where's that upward trajectory? It's with our students of color. So that's the business case and the heart case for DEI. Not only is it the right thing to do, but when it comes to our enrollment focuses, as was mentioned earlier, it makes sense because our students are going to be looking for this. And our faculty and staff, whether they're of color or have a cultural competence and awareness of the importance, are also looking at how this is presented in the hiring practices, on our web pages. What sort of authenticity do we have to these commitments? Because it matters.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And John Ray, just sort of a follow-up for you. How do you think that and I think Sue touched on this a little bit too, like how do the fundamentals of the history of the institution play a role in how we show up now and how we're addressing these issues now?
It's everything, quite frankly. I mean, and I'll tell you what, an eye-opening piece for me is I was always under the guise that that our cabinet, for instance, at our institution, and by the way, this isn't to throw shade at Kutzen. I think we're making great progress. We're definitely aimed in the right direction, and we're making the necessary steps to go in the right direction. However, so I've been to cabinet meetings. I thought that's where the action took place. That's where, and I saw a good representation, not great, but a good representation of diversity within the room. And I was happy to hear. And then I realized some of the things decided they still weren't happening. So why is that? Let me dig deeper. And I attended a board of trustees meeting, and there is where things get moving. And what I happen to see, and at the risk, I'm not, I understand that I may have ageism biases or even biases towards folks of the Caucasian race. But what I saw was every single member was of white male over the age of 60. And so it's all well and good to feel like you're doing something, but the reality of these institutions, they're deeply ingrained in a hierarchy that at the end of the day, no matter how much you do in the weeds on the ground floor, that stuff isn't sustainable. And so the realization is that you're an individual that should be planting seeds, not doing everything there is, because once you're absent, once you move on to another institution, once if there isn't a line item that goes along with programming, that goes along with institutional commitment from the top down, then all that work at the ground level will eventually dissipate. And so the historical means by which the institutions navigate decision-making, policy-making, the hiring practices, that's a top-down thing. So you can yell from the rafters and whatnot, and maybe during this administration, you get a chief diversity officer. Will that position maintain past your administration timeline after 3 or 4 years when it's not a hot topic item, when things seem to go back to the normal for everyone else? Is there a sustainability plan? And the way these institutions are founded, there is, but the sustainability plan goes back to what it originally was. That's why we keep circling back. We have institutions like Kutztown that's made tremendous growth in the early to mid 2000s. I mean, they were doing amazing things, great programming, all-time high in terms of diversity numbers, commitment in terms of budgetary commitment, and now we're back to 1995 when you do comparative numbers. So what type of sustainability can you implement into a historical institution starts, in my opinion, at the very top when you're talking about these board of trustees members and folks who really pull the strings, but are really invisible to the folks doing the work.
So as a follow-up to that, and this is for everybody, you make a great point about the people who have power in the universities, right? And like, how do we get buy-in from the administration, from the board of trustees, from those who have the power? I've been thinking about how there's sort of this idea sometimes that diversity and inclusion equity only benefits the students of color, right? But like we want to make the case that no, this is good for everyone. And so like, how do we get buy-in and support from the people who have the ability to make these big changes in the university?
Let's start with a couple of facts, right? That the world is diverse. And the professions that our students are stepping into, whether it's in business, whether it's in education, the medical fields, the arts, those are fields that are diverse because they are globally engaged and globally connected. So that's the business case to the work of, well, for our role as educators at the institutions that we're in is to ensure that our students can be successful in their careers when they graduate from our institutions. Well, for them to be successful, they need to have this global awareness and global competency about the diversity in the world around us. So how do we do that? And as mentioned earlier, and I'm so glad it was presented by my colleagues here on the panel, we need to recognize that, yes, our faculty are experts in their fields, but we don't spend too much time on the educational experience, right? And pedagogical practices. Well, let's do that, right? Let's invest in our people. And I think as we roll out these messages, we create an understanding that this is a journey for everybody. We all have something to learn. And in delivering that message, I think that also lowers the defense mechanisms that often get brought up, right? And some of the excuses, we don't need that right now. We all have room to grow. This is an institutional imperative for all of us. So let's rally together. And then what does that look like? As Mr. Bennett had shared, we need to ask those questions about representation throughout the organization, the board level to entry level positions, first year students, graduate students, everything in between, right? But we have to first start with just acknowledging the fact, which is, again, we have a responsibility to prepare our students, lifelong learners, to engage in a global community. And we can't do that if we continue with these archaic ways of teaching and the narratives that we provide, because we create a singular mindset as opposed to recognizing the richness, the various colors that are present in the world around us. So that's where I think we need to start, and we have to continue. And again, being conscious of enrollment trends and the opportunities in the business sector, right? Our business and industry colleagues, they're talking about this, which is to my earlier point. So they're looking for students to have this competency when they graduate. So we need to make sure we're preparing them accordingly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it's also important to show that there is already existing buy-in. I know that a lot of the work that goes into getting buy-in from higher level administrators often comes from, faculty and staff who just care a lot, who've had maybe personal experiences, or who have worked with students who have had adverse experiences and they want change. I've been very fortunate at Delaware County Community College, where I came in and was really set up to succeed. I report to the president. I kind of work with a lot of different people, but I think that was only made possible because there were years and years of people saying, we need more of this. We need a chief diversity and inclusion officer. And there was a lot of support before I even came in. And so I think for those who are still looking for that structure, still asking for higher level administrators to make these decisions, it's to also show the buy-in that's already happening. At Delaware County Community College, there was an institutional diversity committee that was created many years ago that was essentially just growing and growing and growing. And this group was able to give voice to say that diversity and inclusion is important at the college, and we value it, and we need more. We need more support. We need this to grow. And so I think that it's almost kind of the coming together of allies, right? And showing that this is something that needs movement on the campus by using things like data, by using things like, what is our mission? Let's return to that. And using that allyship to then create additional buy-in.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I fully support that practical approach. That is my personal approach. As a former math teacher, I'm all about getting data, research, and then finding folks, not just that look like me, but the entire team of allies, of advocates to work together and trying to achieve that buy-in. Now, the secondary approach, the Malcolm approach, if you will, is realizing that at the end of the day, a good movement by students will get the ears of the folks that's needed. And the reality is this: in 2021, we're all antiquated because there's some students on our campuses that have more followers on their Instagram or Twitter account than the entire institution. So the idea of influence has been subverted. These students have more power, more a louder voice than anyone in that administration. You can send out a tweet by Kutztown University and see 1,000 people will see it. Some kid will talk about some Fortnite game he's playing, and people across the globe are paying attention. So if it comes down to it, if that practical approach is not penetrating those forces as it should be, because it's done with professionalism and a show of unity, then sometimes the seed needs to be planted and the students need to get involved. And if that happens, of course, that's not what's preferred, because that usually gets ugly before it gets pretty. But the reality is that, I mean, the students can take control of the narrative at this point, and they're starting to. That generation is going to be the voting majority. That generation is making themselves heard loud and clear. And when it comes time for institutional change, it's either we work towards serious change now so that it's demonstrated and tangible, or they will force change upon us. And so which side do we want to be on? But the reality is, I mean, the students I believe can have an even more profound impact than even us at the staff or administrative level.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point. It's like, you know, the revolution will not be through email, it'll be on Twitter, right? So we have a couple minutes left before we take questions. I guess just to sort of wrap it up, my final thoughts or questions to the panel, twofold, and you can answer one or either, but, and I think Samuel touched on this before, we know that, you know, diversity and inclusion is not enough. That equity piece is really important. So how do we make sure that we show up for students of color once we get them in our universities to support them throughout their experience? And then sort of, you know, the second part of that is for just the everyday professor, professional, staff person, faculty, whatever at the university, what can we do? What can people in the audience do to address or combat institutional racism at their universities or their institutions?
The first thing that comes to mind is I think we need to do a better job of listening to understand as opposed to listening to respond. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what identity you have, whether it's an of color faculty member, a white, you know, majority student on our campus, and everything in between. When a student, when a faculty and staff, especially if they come from a underrepresented population, when they share a concern, we need to listen to that concern, and our response should start with, we can do better. And I think if we start with that understanding, there are many mentors and colleagues who have influenced me in creating that mindset. I know Dr. Kelly Kenny here is on the call, and the Renee Scales and the Dr. Carl S. Moores who speak to that. Let's be open, let's be authentic. And when those concerns are brought to us, when those ideas are brought to us, let's approach it with that love mindset. Let's be humble, and let's honor that. And then let's ask, how do we do better? And that's where the equity piece comes in, recognizing that we all have different things that make up our respective identities, and some of those items need more attention than others depending on the time in which we are in. That's not devaluing anyone else's needs or experiences, right? That's an equity discussion. I don't want to give everyone the same size shoe. I want to give you a shoe that fits. Mm-hmm. And when we have that approach to our work, again, I think that's more inclusive. I think that's more welcoming. And that speaks to the unity piece that Mr. Bennett spoke to a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, yeah. And this idea of listening, right? And I think a lot of times academics, we have this idea that we know what's good for everyone, and we know what's best, and we know what students want and need. And we got to step away from that a little bit, you know, recognize we do have some expertise, but also let's ask students what they need to succeed, and see if we can, you know, provide that, because they know what they need as well. Yeah.
I think it's also important, as we're kind of not taking this one size fits all approach, right? That we're trying to create systems and policies that are a bit more flexible, that allow us to see different student perspectives, but also not see diversity and inclusion as being some sort of end goal. So I think sometimes there's an expectation that eventually the work will be done, right? That everyone will take this new bias training and then we'll all be good, right? Then we're at some endpoint. But I think we have to start seeing it more as a continuous conversation that we're having with each other, that we're having with students. that, the more and the better we get at having that conversation, the easier it will be, the more productive it will be, the more rewarding it will be, and the more we'll be able to create these systems that are not only allowing our students to do their best and allowing our students to succeed, but allowing our faculty, our staff, everyone to really kind of reach their greatest potential. And I think to your question, kind of what's the thing that everyone can start doing is to kind of start having those difficult conversations, kind of finding a person who maybe is around your level, who you trust, who you feel comfortable speaking with, and saying, maybe we can kind of start this journey together. Maybe we can read this book together. I read this article. Will you read it with me? And kind of an invitation to start having these conversations. Because for the people who ask or may ask us, all of us may have had times where people say, how are you so good at talking about this? It's like, because I've talked about it a lot, right? And I've messed up already. I've already had those moments where, I had to learn, and I'm always learning. And so it's a little bit easier for me to do that deep dive. And so practicing, because it's a skill, it's not kind of an endpoint.
Mm-hmm. And absolutely, we can't plead ignorance anymore, because literally all the information is at our fingertips. And even now, there's so many resources of that I've seen floating around of different ways that you can learn, articles, books, movies, documentaries, everything to sort of get you caught up so you can start to have those conversations. So that's a great point. Donna, any final thoughts before we take questions?
Sure. Well, the last piece I'd say, because my two peers just dropped some great jewels. I would just say accountability. There's a role you can play in accountability in every public forum, asking those questions, why, digging deeper. Because at the end of the day, equity isn't the end game. The end game is figuring out what caused the inequalities and then removing those barriers too. And so for right now, equity is definitely what we need to strive for, where we need to go. And then once we get there, knowing that there's still more to do. So asking those questions, and if your institution seems to have an answer for everything, then you ask, okay, so do we know what caused these inequalities, and what are we doing to be proactive in ensuring that we don't revisit those inequalities again, those deficits again?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're going to invite Diane back now so that she can post some questions from our audience. Is that what's going to happen, I think? Yes, okay, great.
Yeah, so I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, to please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will systematically work our way through them. We did get a question earlier that I thought was a really, one that also has to do with the aging faculty that exists at a lot of higher education institutions, faculty that are predominantly white. And Catherine asked the question, if undergrads had to take a mandatory race relations training, how would the professors be prepared to facilitate them if they are unprepared to address these issues in their regular course load?
I can simply because I think we have to, even in this space, even though we're all trying to be open-minded, redefine what a professor is. If it's someone who is, or by the traditional terms, right, we're talking about experts in their field, then we would go get them. There's a panel here, there's a panel, facilitating PDs and whatnot throughout the nation. Are they going to be 50-year-old white men with doctorates? Maybe not. But why don't we redefine what it takes, or what qualifications are required to put someone in front to lead that informational change and proactive difference. So I think when I recommended that or stated that, my mindset was going to the individuals who have been driving change, doing DEI work throughout. I think it's as a teacher, as a former teacher, it is easier. We're teaching all the time. We're having these conversations, and we're doing it in a different way, directly through engagement, not necessarily through a textbook, which can be more profound, more impactful, more influential, and hopefully get the results, the outcomes that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, if you have an interest in doing this work, you can learn and teach yourself to do this work, right? Like my background is I'm a therapist. I'm a trauma therapist. I am not someone who was trained in how to talk about race or race relations or anti-racism. Certainly social justice is part of my social work training, but I have a vested interest in this for my students and my students' well-being and my department's well-being. So I did the work. I read and I talked to people and I went to workshops and I took trainings on how, and I messed up a lot, like Samuel said. Like, this is not, you know, I have a good friend who talks about the dental hygiene school of racism, right? And so it's like, it's not a one and done. You don't go get your tooth pulled and then you're done with racism forever, right? But you go back, you get your teeth clean, you get your hygienist to make sure your teeth are shiny and white, you know? It's like you're constantly learning and you're constantly developing your skills. Things are constantly changing. And so if you have an interest in doing the work, you keep working. And you don't say, all right, got that tooth pulled, my racism is gone, I get it now, you know? You keep learning and you keep working and you keep talking to people so that you can have these conversations and start to teach, you know, and facilitate these conversations.
And I think that then we as or those who are in higher administrative positions then have to make sure that those resources are easily available for faculty members who then want to do that deep dive. So my background, I've done a lot with faculty development, and I always love the conversations where kind of very casually a faculty member may send me an email or have a call and say, hey, I'm kind of struggling with this. I haven't put this in my lesson before. I'm a little bit worried because this is happening. So can you talk to me a little bit about this? Where I'm always under the assumption that faculty want their students to succeed. They want their students to do the best that they can. And so that if the resources are given, that hopefully the people will take advantage of them. Now, I know that that is kind of a more simple solution. And of course, sometimes we have to think about what are the incentives? What are we doing to actually get people involved? But I think ultimately through some things that might be a little bit required, I don't really care for mandatory trainings necessarily, but maybe a little bit that's required, and then a lot that might be desired by the faculty, that we can have these things readily available so that when people make a mistake, that there's someone there to help them, not someone who's there to shame them, right? And then when people want more, that it's there for them. And I'm a big proponent of that.
And if I could just add, because everything else that was stated, I don't need to repeat, but the mandatory training piece, I think that's an important item for us to speak to super quick. That I agree. I'm not a fan of mandatory training. I'm not even a fan of the word training, because what comes up in your head when you hear the word training is I'm going to step into a virtual or real room and someone's going to tell me how to do my job, as opposed to how about we go to a professional development engagement, right? Well, what sort of images pop into your head when you hear that? Oh, we're going to have a conversation, right? It's a collaborative discussion. So one, that's more inviting, but two, to what Mr. Bennett said a little bit earlier, accountability. If we start asking our faculty and staff annually in their evaluations, how are you demonstrating a commitment to DEI? The attendance in all those different sessions and professional development engagements, guess what? The numbers increase, because we are creating that accountability measure that this matters. This value commitment matters. And when we speak to it regularly in our staff meetings, in our faculty meetings, even our divisional and all faculty governance meetings, that accountability piece, that value proposition that we've articulated, folks are going to start doing their own self-discovery and exploration to make sure that they can demonstrate that commitment in their work.
And that's, someone mentioned hiring earlier, or search committees. I've been on more search committees than I care to even discuss. And that's something else. But one of the things that we've started to include in our questions when we're interviewing candidates is, to talk about your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Have you done this work in your past institutions, your past places of employment? And if not, how will you do it at this university? Because it's an important value to us here.
Scott, you brought up a really interesting point about faculty evaluation think, it's important that we ask the question, but then also when we are evaluating faculty, that we prioritize that as well. Often these faculty evaluations have 100 questions, and then there's focus on, 3 or 4. Well, certainly I think DEI work should be one of the ones that we focus on.
Correct. And sometimes then there's a question when we start navigating that space. Well, how do we do that? And as you had mentioned before, well, we have all these other things that we need to assess. This is another thing. And the response to that is something that often comes up as a response to it as well, which is, if it matters, we will make it matter, right? If we're going to value it, we are going to create a commitment to put resources, to put time, and all those different things. And I think the best example of that is what's occurred over the last year. How many times were we hesitant to engage in the technology space, just generally, whether it's teaching approaches, engagements, even doing things like this in Zoom? We were commenting on that right before we started the event. Well, what's happened? We've seen the opportunities, and we also made investments to ensure that we can be successful in this space. And within a year, not even a year, look at where we've been. If we were to make those same investments and commitments to DEI, where would we be? And that's, again, we have to articulate it's a value, and then we have to commit resources, time, financial, and people to be able to make it happen. And we've seen it occur just within the last 11 months. And I think it provides a good blueprint for us moving forward.
I agree. There was one other comment that I wanted to draw attention to in the chat, which is a comment by Eric. He said, I wonder whether declining enrollments due to the pandemic, which is disproportionately having a negative impact on African American and Latinx students, will motivate some institutions to place more of a priority on the need to attract and retain students of color. And I thought that was such an interesting comment, because at the same time, there's some real budgetary concerns happening in higher ed. And there's this balance that needs to happen between prioritizing, right, and yet at the same time, managing budgets. And I was just curious if any of you had thoughts on that.
Being in admissions currently, I do believe it's going to have an effect. However, I don't anticipate if the prospect of the Latinx population becoming what it plans to be over the next 10 years or so, 9 years or so, if the fact that we're making up, especially at Kutztown, where we're so close to the Lehigh Valley, Berks County, and Philadelphia counties, which are all predominantly students of color, if that situation, sans pandemic, sans anything else, isn't motivation enough with the declining enrollment to make those changes or make those initiatives matter and put some meat behind it, then I'm not sure that this will change that. What I do think is, what I know that we've already begun to do is finally truly pay attention to the retention piece. Because especially within the communities, the Latinx community, the Black communities, the word of mouth, the students doing well and going back to their communities and sharing their experience does way more than a billboard. And if you want to talk about a penny saved is a penny earned, for every student, if we increase that 40% retention to 50, 60%, now you're not forced to come up with new budgetary strategies every year, reinventing the wheel to increase enrollment. So I think that realization occurred prior to the pandemic. Perhaps the pandemic is fanning the flames a little bit to ensure that we follow through. But I don't know that, I'm sure it drew the attention, but I don't feel, from my personal experience thus far, that it's actually, lit a fire under anyone's butt just yet.
Great.
Can I add to that really quick, Dr. Elliott? The other thing that attention is important. Something we haven't spoken to all too much, although I think it's an important aspect of this enrollment piece, is also articulate to speak to the dynamics that unfortunately exist on our campuses with respect to our transfer processes. So you want to talk about amazing opportunities for us to provide pathways, opportunities, in spaces in which actually you want to talk about some of the most ethnically diverse student populations in the Commonwealth, they're in our community colleges. So for us in higher education at the traditional four-year institutions to ask those questions of why aren't we leaning in more on those opportunities, right? We have students who are looking at our academic programs, whether it's here at Desales, our business programs, our sports managements, our health professions, and for our other institutions represented here on the call. Why can't we be more inviting in that space? Because unfortunately, we do create barriers and obstacles, and there's all sorts of bias there, right? Well, we won't accept this credit, but we'll accept this one. Why? Why? If a student has been successful in that space, why wouldn't we try to move things actually to make that easier for them as opposed to more difficult, especially, again, when the vast majority of our ethnically diverse populations happen to be at our two-year colleges in the Commonwealth. And it's important for us to absolutely, as Mr. Bennett said, we need to focus on retention. What does that look like, right? What is the experience for our students of color on campus? What sort of opportunities are there? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's everything from representation in the classroom to, do we have offerings for our Muslim students in the cafeteria, our Jewish students in the cafeteria? It's everything in between. Those things matter. But I think to have that nuanced approach is important because the opportunities are definitely ahead of us.
Thank you. We have one final question that I see in the chat. Dory asked, how do we prepare our students for the workplace when it seems many employers have either not made DEI a priority or just now promoting DEI? Yet to be seen if this is a trend or a full commitment. How much responsibility should we put on higher ed leadership and administration to include employers in these discussions and engagement with students?
I'll say that the employers are looking for those opportunities. So I think it is incumbent upon, I think it's really important for our leadership, not just the VP suite and the AVPs and the presidents, but even our academic division leadership to make those connections. And how do you do that? And what's the value add in doing so? Well, one, let's say you're an academic department that maybe is lacking in ethnic diversity, but if you're able to build those pathways and those partnerships with business and industry, we might be able to bring in successful business leaders who are of color, or maybe a woman who's in a STEM field. So students can see, right, that power of representation that we've explored earlier before. They have, be involved in community organizations, right? That's where those conversations and those collaborations occur. The number of committees that I'm personally on, and I do that intentionally because of the very question that was asked, because then we can turn around and have those conversations with our business department, with our health sciences department, with our education department about building those pathways. And it's all about our students. It really is, for career placement, success. And as Mr. Bennett said before, when our students are successful in those spaces, we can really build upon that in our future enrollment efforts. But we have to make the commitment of time and recognizing the value add that time places in our work, and especially that representation piece. I think there's a really great value there of showing our students Black and brown excellence and thinking about other identities that maybe are underrepresented in the academy, but we can lean in on some great examples and mentors that are out there in business and industry.
I think this is a great question, and I do think it's a little bit of a challenge, right? Because to a certain extent, when our students graduate and then go into different careers, we may not have a lot of control over what that looks like. But I think that kind of to something we were talking about earlier in the discussion, if we are having more of these conversations about inclusivity and diversity in all sectors and all majors, then I think that is what starts to help prepare students. So for example, we know that for people of color, for women in fields like engineering, there's not a lot of representation, and there is a chance that people can go into workplaces that aren't necessarily built for them. And I think that if we're having more conversations about bias in engineering, right? What that looks like. That for students in our colleges, they may already have experience having those conversations. And so we can't necessarily maybe prepare a student for everything that they're going to experience, but I think we can at least give them the tools to be able to have conversations and be able to almost know what to expect. I knew there was a chemistry teacher in my previous institution who made a point when he was looking at the different award winners for chemistry, that they were almost entirely white men, right? And he made sure that he took time to explain why that was, why there was exclusion in the chemistry field, and how most people who win awards are doing so after, say, 40 years of experience. And that's kind of, how this happens. And so I think that if we're having these conversations where maybe they're not a huge part of the curriculum, but that each of our students, depending on their field, understands what bias exists within their field and understand how they can experience it or how they can combat it, then I think that's giving them at least some basic tools to be able to grapple with this. Additionally, if we do have the capacity, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but if we can partner with workplaces nearby, I know often colleges do, that maybe we also try to incorporate them in our DEI discussions. If there is a event, maybe we're inviting them to. If there is a training that we offer for free or a professional development that's free, maybe we're inviting them to. So figuring out if we have the capacity to share resources, how we can do that as well.
Last question, I promise. Somebody asked a really great question about the retention of faculty and staff, and the idea that there are, barriers to recruitment, but certainly once a person of color comes to campus, how do we go about keeping them? Unfortunately, there's a lot of talk without a lot of real support, and people of color will often leave because of lack of promotion opportunities, salary issues, lack of support from mentorship, etc. And this individual also added, look at the Black, Indigenous, people of color rates of leaving the institution. Turnaround time averages 1 to 3 years. And they don't stay overall long-term because they feel not being honest with them. So final thoughts on that.
This is like my whole life right now. We've been dealing with this years. I don't have an answer, but I will say that, we've been having these conversations. Certainly, I think having more Black and brown faculty in positions of leadership is helpful if people are willing to take those positions. One of the things that has been my experience and experience of some of my colleagues that are, I guess, particularly color, right? Like there's this invisible labor that we sort of perform when Black and brown students come to us because there's only one of us there or a few of us there. And so there's no accounting for that in the tenure process, right? Like no one cares that all the Black girl students are coming to your office every day because they're comfortable talking to you and they see themselves in you. But sort of how do we, and I think a good question for me is like, how do we account for those, that labor that Black and brown professors or faculty are doing, because it helps retention, right? Like when the students see other people that they can relate to and talk to, how do you account for that, right? Like having some mechanism that sort of addresses that or helps the department to understand that. Another thing I think, which is, I think there's some data to support this, like cluster hires. So if you do get a good pool of diverse applicants, hiring 2 people of color at the same time, so they sort of have a bond and that, can sort of like work through, the system together. There's some data to support that helps retention. So we've been looking at that as well. But obviously, I think probably all the panelists would say that this continues to be a big area of concern in lots of universities, predominantly white institutions.
Agreed, it is a struggle, and agreed as well that plenty of time dedicated on this particular topic, really more so than others, and actually understandably so. Because if we were to really be genuine about responding to our numbers at our institutions, we probably have, with our students of color demographics, depending on where we're at, we're probably in the high teens, maybe in the 20s, maybe in the 30s, depending on where we're at. Community colleges may be higher. But if we look at our faculty and staff of color, those numbers are much lower. So yes, let's continue to focus the intensity of diverse students in our enrollments. But really, we should be spending more, because that is a huge gap in numbers. So for us to, back to retention, right, for us to be able to retain our students at a higher rate, again, representation matters. So let's look at, yes, what sort of process do we have in our hiring process, right? What sort of bias might exist there? That's important. And then once the professional is hired and they're at our institution, let's build community. So let's develop things such as employee resource groups or caucuses. Now, there has been a lot of professional journals and articles from the Deloittes of the world talking about how they sometimes don't work. Our caucuses can work if they are committed to larger efforts. So if you have a university diversity committee, have representatives from your caucuses there, because now there's an outlet for their concerns to be given more of an opportunity to be listened to for action. But when we build communities there, that helps to build some mentorship. And then when we build those accountability measures, right, and we ask our faculty and staff to demonstrate a commitment, what does that look like in the classroom or out of the classroom? If you're a student affairs practitioner, for example, those again are other opportunities in which our faculty and staff, especially if they're of color, to be able to demonstrate their skills, their commitments, the contributions they've made to supporting our students. That way we can actually measure it, we can incentivize it. And when we do that, we build a commitment to our faculty and staff, and that helps them stay. That helps them stay because they can see that their work is valued.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'd like to wrap this up and thank our panelists for joining us today and for sharing their expertise. I think I speak on behalf of everyone in the audience when I say we all walked away with some new knowledge, ideas, and really a good foundation for moving forward with improving diversity issues on our campuses. I'd like to invite everyone to now join us in the networking area where you will be able to chat with colleagues. To do so, simply click the networking button on the left side of your screen and click the blue ready button when you're ready to be randomly matched with another attendee. It will be a video chat by default, but you will be able to turn off your video by clicking the video camera icon if you choose. You will have up to 3 minutes to chat, but may click the extend button if you'd both like to chat longer. You can also end the chat before the 3 minutes by clicking the leave button. You will be able to view each other's email addresses in the connections section of your Hopin account. Also, before you leave, please be sure to check out our sponsors and complete our brief post-session evaluation, both of which can be found in the reception area. Click on the sponsor's logo to visit their website. If you have enjoyed this session and are interested in joining the DVAC committee, we'd certainly welcome you to do so. There's an interest form link in the reception area. And finally, if you have not yet registered for our final and keynote session, Humanizing the Virtual Workplace, Creating Community with Students and Staff in 2021 and Beyond, which will be held next Friday, February 26th at 9 a.m. Please go to dvac.com for program information and the registration link. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Everyone.